Panthers. They were 7-6 this year, 3-9 last season, and all things considered, they exceeded expectations, but almost in all the wrong ways. And what I mean by that is winning their first 7 games, then just going on a total mudslide, losing 6 in a row. The only other team to do that in college football history was back in 2018 when South Florida did that. And all things considered, it seemed like Pittsburgh was heading in the right direction in the sense of they brought in Kade Bell from Western Carolina. They were going to run a spread no huddle offense. They brought in Desmond Reed, who was awesome for Western Carolina and was an immediate contributor to this football team. And then I think everything kind of felt different after that SMU and that Virginia game. And in many ways, there's teams were picking up on how to stop them. And before I go far into it, Eli Holstein deserves a lot of credit. The redshirt freshman coming in from Alabama who has just been slinging it all over the field and quite frankly didn't have as many weapons as I think a lot of people might think. But also he was getting pressured just time and time again. I think the offensive line was quite frankly not as strong as we've seen in years past. Versus in the SMU game, Eli Holstein was pressured 20 different times. And when you're pressured that many different times and whatnot too, it's just a recipe for disaster too. And you can even go back and think about the UCal game too, when they play against strong secondaries and whatnot. Eli Holstein kind of got away with being able to throw some balls into really tight coverages, but when you play secondaries to that degree, you can't get away with stuff like that. And I think it's one of those things too where Eli Holstein kind of has to learn the growing pains of being a young quarterback. But at the same time, too, Pat Narduzzi and this staff has to put the team in a way where they're successful. And at times there are moments where you certainly question that because Narduzzi's going to his 11th season. And, I am a Narduzzi guy. I do believe in him. I think he in many ways exactly what you would want out of Pittsburgh football. And you think of back to the other head coaches they have. I think of Dave Weinstead, who was also a Pittsburgh alumni, and they always value guys who have a connection to the area, who instill that sort of gritty, blue collar sort of attitude of, hey, we're gonna run the ball, we're gonna play hard, and we're gonna play tough, disciplined defense. And in many ways, too, even in my preview of Pittsburgh before the season, I think everybody kind of knew there would be some bumps in the road and whatnot, too, of the Kade Bell offense. And you're not exactly sure how some of these younger players would come in immediately. But at the same time, too, it seems like that the issues that Pittsburgh Panthers are having are the same issues that we're seeing over and over and over again. I mean, even if we go back to 2022 and 2023 before they won the ACC championship back in 2021, the same issues to me seem to be lingering. And those issues, at least to me, is that the most common thread that I see throughout is the lack of discipline on this team, particularly on the offensive line. I mean, I go back and think about the Clemson game where, thank God I didn't go to that game because I was gonna go see that at Heinz Stadium. But Pittsburgh had 13 penalties versus Clemson, and in many ways, they had a legitimate chance to win that game. And if it wasn't for a penalty that was called back, they were in a spot to be up 2017 versus Pittsburgh in the fourth quarter with very little time remaining, but Kate Klubnik ended up coming back and being able to win the game 24-20. But at the same time, they put themselves in the position where they're shooting themselves in the foot over and over again. And when you look at the beginning of the season, I mean, hey, they knocked off some legitimate teams. I go back and think about that quality win that they had versus North Carolina. They won 34-24. I go back and think about the Backyard Bowl versus West Virginia, which is always a huge confidence booster, especially earlier in the season. And then I go back and think about that Syracuse game too, where they completely just had Kyle McCord's number that night. He threw for 5 interceptions, either 2 or 3 pick sixes. I mean, that was the game where, to me, this Pittsburgh team really felt like that they could be a threat in the ACC. And to go from the amount of success that you had versus a really strong Syracuse team, by the way, who ended up being ranked in the top 25 towards the end of the season. But at the same time, too, you get to a point where every dog's going to have their day. And I think that's kind of how it feels with Pittsburgh, because in many ways, yes, they did overachieve to some extent, right? We thought to themselves, okay, according to the ACC media poll, they were going to be ranked 13th going into the season. If they even made it to a bowl game, I would say that's a pretty successful season even going into it. So I think part of the issue that you have here is, well, they went 3-9 last year, and you knew they had to take a significant step up. However, when you sit there and you talk about that step up, for them to go on a 6-game landslide, for you to have the same issues that you're having over and over again, particularly with the offensive line not being able to protect Eli Holstein, and particularly in those kind of crunch time moments where a lot of the game management, I think, is worth pointing out. I go back to that Toledo Bowl game, and granted, I get it's not a regular season game. It's a little bit different. But at the same time, I go back and think of that overtime matchup where Pittsburgh already held Toledo to a field goal, and all Pitt had to do was score a touchdown, and it was third down at the 1-yard line, and instead of using your running back who's averaged about 5 yards a carry, you decide to get cute and hike it straight to your tight end and do an option pass and ask your tight end to be able to try to thread the needle with a guy in the end zone, and that ultimately didn't work out. And on top of that, too, instead of just saying, you know what, it's a bowl game, we're going to go for it, we're at Ford Field, and we're going to try to make this work and win the game, they double down and kick a field goal. And ultimately, it cost them the game because Toledo ended up winning the game 48-46 in 6 overtimes, which was a total thriller to watch. And all things considered, probably a game that Toledo did deserve to win. But at the same time, you sit there and say to yourself, those mental mistakes end up making the difference between them leading off at a positive note, being at least walking in being 8-5, versus talking about them in a 6-game losing streak and then wondering where they go from here. Because now that I look at their 2025 recruiting class, I say to myself, there's no blue chip recruits, only one 4-star kid coming in. You're 52nd in 2025 right now compared to 45th before. You're 11th in the ACC, and you were 10th last season. So relatively speaking, relatively comparable. And I think where you also have an issue with Pittsburgh football, aside from the discipline issue that I talked about, is they're going to have to be more aggressive in NIL if they really want to kind of take that next step forward. Because I think in many ways that's also why they decided to hire a new athletic director too, is really be able to tap into that market as well. And they created Alliance 412, which is Pittsburgh's equivalent of their collective and everything. But you sit there and say to yourself, okay, you invested your first $20 million. You're going to spread that out through a bunch of different sports. And they also created a bunch of different facilities for a bunch of the non-revenue sports as well, which is money that they're going to have to make up as well. So I think for one point, there are a lot more behind the scenes things that are going on than you would imagine too, in the sense of, hey, Chris Bickle, who's one of the founders of the collective, he donated $20 million to the football program back in 2021, and that was the year they won the ACC title. But you have to imagine too, there's going to be a point where these big donors, these collectives, are going to say to themselves, hey, we're not just going to sit here and be content with 6-7 wins every year. How do we get to that 8, 9, 10 win season and actually be in a really strong bowl game? Now, granted, they're definitely not in position to be national contenders anytime soon, and they're nowhere near the levels of Clemson or Miami, for example. However, you do sit there and say to yourself, hey, you have a North Carolina team that's a big question mark. You have a Virginia Tech team that didn't play as well as you thought they would. You have a Florida State team who didn't achieve at all what they were supposed to. So yes, there definitely is some legitimate opportunity for Pittsburgh to make some noise in the ACC, but until they resolve the discipline issues, until they be aggressive more in the NIL, and it seems like that money actually is coming in, and you kind of clean up that game management stuff going on, you're going to kind of be in the same sort of thread that you've been in for the past couple seasons here. I'm not going to sit here and say Pat Narduzzi should be fired, because I won't really ever say that on the show unless he does something inexplicable to the point where he just shouldn't be here anymore, because he is the right guy for the job. He is a phenomenal recruiter. He knows how to motivate his players. He has an identity for his team, and a lot of these guys seem to buy into that. But it's, how do you fix these mistakes that we've been seeing over and over and over again? Because you have a well-experienced staff around you. You play in one of the best conferences in all of college football, especially one of the most competitive, and you're in a space where the administration is finally starting to back you guys, and now it's time to put some results out on the field